answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise virtually in the House tonight to pursue a question I initially asked in question period. It was asked on November the 14th, just as COP27, the 27th Conference of the Parties of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, was underway in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. The Secretary General of the United Nations opened that conference saying this, that the world is, quote, on a highway to climate hell, foot still on the accelerator. That is the situation we are in today. And the question I put to the minister was whether the prime minister had chosen to stay away from Sharm el-Sheikh and COP27, knowing that we are one of those countries with the foot on the accelerator. In response, and I want to concentrate more on the time I have this evening with the response I received from the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, that we're doing wonderful things in Canada, that our foot isn't on the accelerator, that we can ignore what we're doing in expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, in the shameful decision to buy the Kinder Morgan pipeline and then spend public money on building a project that violates Indigenous rights, which threatens the ecosystems at the 800 crossings of watercourses between Alberta and the Port of Burnaby, threatens the ecosystems of the Salish Sea with a spill of not crude oil, but even more impossible to clean up, diluted bitumen. But all of that we can set aside and ignore because of all the wonderful things the government is doing. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary pointed to $100 billion in climate spending and $9 billion in an emissions reduction plan. Let's be honest about this. Let's stop pretending that we're spending billions of dollars and that will protect our children and grandchildren from an unlivable world. When the Secretary General speaks of climate hell, he's not being hyperbolic. It's the reality of the science we're looking at that is deeply distressing. In fact, looking at it soberly, it's terrifying. One of the things we know is the IPCC report from last spring, April 4th, said that the opportunity we have to hold to the Paris commitments of holding to 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase and as far below 2 degrees as possible, both of those goals, both of those avoidances of the worst, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made it clear neither will be possible unless global emissions of greenhouse gases hit their peak and then drop rapidly before, emphasize the before, 2025. So we're at 2023, got less than 24 months to ensure that global emissions hit their highest ever level and drop rapidly from there. So the government of Canada continues to pretend that by spending money on electric cars, which is a good thing to do, spending money on consumer heat pumps, a good thing to do, they can distract the Canadian public from the fact that they're spending $8 billion on more subsidies through something called carbon capture and storage, which all around the world has already been shown to be highly expensive and highly ineffective. We're also spending hundreds of millions of dollars on nuclear technology, which is not a solution to the climate crisis. We're putting money into $21 billion, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office, into what we now own, the Government of Canada's own personal, our pipeline that we all are shareholders in it, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, for a horrible total of $21 billion. In other words, this government is spending more, putting the foot on the accelerator on the climate, the highway to climate hell, than we are in avoiding that disaster.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Building on the outcomes of COP26, Canada's engagement in the lead up to and at COP27 was an opportunity to highlight our government's ambitious domestic climate actions, including by sharing best practices and lessons learned, as well as advocate for ambitious and concrete action by all, particularly major emitters. Our government was pleased to set up Canada's first national pavilion at COP27, providing an opportunity to showcase Canadian climate action, amplify global efforts, and support the developing countries and support the Egyptian presidency priorities. Canada continues to work with all parties to make the UNFCCC process as effective as possible with a focus on implementation. Mr. Speaker, it is undeniable that the impacts of a changing climate pose a serious and significant threat not only to our health but also to the Canadian economy. I agree with the honourable member that Canada and indeed all of the world's nations need to step up efforts to decarbonize our economies in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. That is why, since coming to power, our government has taken bold and decisive action by introducing strong environmental legislation and by putting in place regulations that will cap emissions and set Canada on a path to becoming net zero by 2050. Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague knows our government has committed to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by the year 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. We introduced the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act to help us deliver on these commitments. Most recently, we released the 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan. This plan includes a $9.1 billion in new investments and provides framework for meeting our 2030 emissions reduction target. During the last federal election, we pledged to step up our efforts to reduce Canada's reliance on more carbon-intensive sources of energy by accelerating our G20 commitment to eliminate fossil fuels from 2025 to 2023. We have invested over $120 billion, not 100, but $120 billion on climate action and the environmental protection that will bring forward results throughout the Canadian economy. Mr. Speaker, the environmental measures we have brought forward are intended to provide a cleaner and a healthier environment for our children and grandchildren while promoting a strong economy that works for Canadians and their families. Mr. Speaker, from a consumer's point of view, may I just quickly add, when we talk about things such as the banning of single plastic items, when we talk in terms of the planting of literally hundreds of millions of trees, when we talk about the types of things that Canadians can actually step up and also contribute. So there's the bigger macro issues that the government is dealing with, and there's also those issues that Canadians have demonstrating a wonderful willingness to be able to participate in making our planet a greener and better place to be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to my honourable friend and parliamentary secretary. Look, it's when the parliamentary secretary, like so many Liberals before him, use words like, quote, bold and decisive to describe Liberal climate action, they probably believe it, but just for honesty's sake, let's take out bold and decisive and put in what it is, incremental. Incremental things that, like Christmas baubles on the Christmas tree, but do nothing to ensure our kids will have a livable world. I don't envy my friends, such as the Honourable Minister for Environment and Climate Change or the Prime Minister, that they've run out of time for wiggle room and run out of time for procrastination. Governments before them, I've been working on this issue since 1986, governments before them have used up all that time. We are now in a crisis, and the contest is between what's politically feasible and what's scientifically necessary. We are still playing with our children's future by betting on doing too little and leaving it till too late.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What's important to recognize that the impacts of the climate change continue to intensify, as witnessed most recently through the destructive forces of Hurricane Fiona that devastated a number of areas throughout Atlantic Canada. It is evident that we must adapt and adapt quickly to our ever-changing environment. That is why our government is working on finalizing Canada's first national adaptation strategy with partners. Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes that we need to do more to help prevent and protect our citizens against climate change. I look forward to continuing to work with my honourable colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands to achieve our mutual objectives. Mr. Speaker, I think at the end of the day that we are moving very much in a progressive fashion forward on our environment, and I do appreciate the many contributions that the Leader of the Green Party has put forward.